Hey folks, welcome back. In this video we are going to be discussing Affliction talents. We do have a slight concession to make following up from our Warlock class tree, but we'll do that at the start as we get into things. So without any further delay, let's move right on to that, shall we? So, starting with the concession then to the previous video, as raised up by one of our viewers, Matt Sins. Again, thank you for pointing this out on my video. The Wowhead talent calculator that I used for that video wasn't showing up the free talent point that Warlocks get at level 10, and unlike other specs, like Retribution Paladin, for instance, or just Paladin in general, if you change the spec, their free talent of choice changes. So if you're Holy and Protection, you're getting Lay on Hands, and if you're a Retribution Paladin, you get Hammer of Wrath and Auras of Swift Vengeance for free. Warlocks don't seem to have that at the moment. We just get Curses of Enfeeblement baseline. So, Curse of Tongues, Curse of Exhaustion, and it is irrespective of which specialization we pick. And as Matt mentions in a comment in the previous video, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. For Affliction, having curses would make sense, but for Demonology, having something like Fell Domination, probably going to be more beneficial because you're more in sync with your pets. And for Destruction, the whole Fire, Chaos, and Brimstone, having Burning Rush might make more sense baseline and kind of just opens us up. But, as I say, at the moment, the Wowhead trees, and as it currently looks on the alpha, thanks to Matt, it seems to be that just Curse of Enfeeblement is baseline. This does free up a point as you play around the tree that allows for a little bit more utility, and you can end up quite comfortably picking Demonic Circle and still having your three bottom traits in Summon Jailer, Decimating Bolt, and Dimensional Rift. So taking that into account, the rest of my previous video is still accurate, so link in the description below for that. Let's get onto the Affliction side of things though. And the first things to address for Affliction is, unfortunately, Malefic Rapture is here to stay. There is a debate to be made whether or not you like the Malefic Rapture playstyle, or you preferred it when Unstable Affliction was the shard spender that we had previously back in like BFA and things like that. Now, the reason this camp is different is when we start getting into cooldown usage and stuff, when we talk towards the bottom of the talent, you'll be able to see why this matters to people. But Malefic Rapture's here to stay, so point into it, and then you're given a choice. The left side of the tree, for the most part, is much more single target focused with some elements of AoE, and the right side is more AoE focused with some elements of single target applied to it. And this choice is very much shown early with the choice between Unstable Affliction and Seeds of Corruption. Now, Seed of Corruption hasn't changed at all. It's still the way it is in live. Same with Unstable Affliction. Just a dot that you maintain on the target, and it generates a soul shard if the target dies. And so the Seeds is obviously a shard spending AoE application for Corruption. As it detonates, it puts corruption on everything. The third row gives us access to Nightfall. Now, Nightfall is a talent that isn't really played very often for Affliction Warlocks because it is competing with Drained Soul or Inevitable Demise. Generally speaking, those two talents have always been stronger than Nightfall due to its low proc rate and the fact that the occasional augmented Shadowbolt doesn't really help us all that much because we were already a reasonably mobile healer, DPS, sorry. And it's only when we started getting into using Malefic Wrath did Affliction Warlock start getting really, really static because we were trying to maintain buffs and everything. So, Nightfall, it's nice to see, but whether you'll take it or not very much depends on if you want to go into something like Inevitable Demise. And as we discussed in the previous video, utilizing that with Claw of Endoreth and Soul Rot and things like that. But thankfully it is only a 1 point spend, so it's not too shabby. Zavian Teachings, on the other hand, Corruption is now instant cast and instantly deals 13.8% spell power damage. This is basically our ranks 2 and 3 for Corruption, for Affliction Warlocks, essentially, in the Corruption has a base cast of, I believe, about 1.2 to 1.5 seconds, depending on your haste, and Zavian Teachings will just remove that, so it becomes the instant cast you know and love when playing at a higher level. So you're going to want that, otherwise you're going to be spending a lot of time casting and not doing much else. You then have Sow the Seeds, which is a natural augmentation to Seed of Corruption. Basically spews out 2 additional seeds. Quite nice, really useful, especially if you're doing a Mythic Plus setting or some raid bosses like Vigilant Guardian, or maybe Zymox if you're going over. Not sure why you'd go over, but some people might. Now, the fourth row, as we go into the last part of tier 1, as we'll call it, within the tree, you have Inevitable Demise. Now, Inevitable Demise, damaging an enemy with Agony increases the damage of your next drain life by 7%, 15 if you put 2 points into it, and the effect stacks up to 50 times. This means that, generally speaking, you're going to be drain lifing only at 50 stacks, and given the nature of some encounters, that might be once a minute, that could be once every 30 seconds, it depends on how many targets you have active at any moment. But you, as I said previously, you can augment this with talents in the class tree and further in the affliction tree, where drain life could become quite a powerful bursty button, especially with Inevitable Demise present. Following across from that, you have Pandemic Invocation. Pandemic Invocation is a talent that's not really going to change the way you play, it's actually just going to reward you for refreshing correctly. And the reason for that is because refreshing Corruption, Agony, or Siphon Life with less than 5 seconds remaining will deal 964 shadow damage and has a 6.66 chance to grant you a Soul Shard. With putting 2 points into this, this doesn't change the value of the numbers, so it's likely, that these numbers may change. Whether it be that it will do increased shadow damage or have a greater chance to proc, we don't know yet. Obviously, subject to tuning. But generally speaking, Pandemic Invocation is going to be very, very nice as a shard generation tool that isn't going to have to rely on things like Drain Soul sniping or needing multiple targets for Agonies out. Because in a single target setting, our shard generation is tied to Agony and can be rather RNG in places. So having Pandemic Invocation is going to be a nice way to smooth that out, essentially. Following across from that, you have Writhing Agony. Writhing Agony has been split from its current iteration of just going straight up to, ramps up to 18 stacks and starts at 4 stacks upon application, to being a 2 and 4 split, specifically depending on how many points you put into it, which is quite nice. And it does mean that we're going to get a more damage from our Agonies. On the far right, you have Agonizing Corruption. Seed of Corruption's explosion increases the stack count of Agony by 1 or 2, once you put 2 points into it, on all targets hit. Now, this is going to be rather large when it comes to AoE settings and Mythic Plus. The reason for this is because you have to spec into Sow the Seeds to get it, which means that you're throwing out 3 Seed of Corruptions every time you cast a seed. Essentially, you're getting 3 times the benefit, which means that rather than increasing the stack count by 2, you're increasing the stack count by 6. This means that very, very rapidly, you're going to get max stacks of Agony out across the board. And depending on the key difficulty that you're going to do, or the encounter difficulty, as that broadens it out for raiding purposes as well, Agony has always been one of those things where unless it's going to last 70-80% of an Agony's duration, you're not going to be able to get the benefit from it. And in past expansions like BFA, if something wasn't going to live the full duration of Agony, you just cast essentially Seed of Corruptions and Shadow Bolted, or Drain Souled, because that was more damage value than trying to get the Agonies out and the little bit of Agony ramp. Agonizing Corruption allows you to ramp your agonies faster to the point where they become beneficial regardless. Because you have to bear in mind, you can get, if it's going to start at 4 stacks, you're putting 3 seeds out, which is 6, you're immediately getting a 10 stack of agony, which, without Writhing Agony, is a full cost. And then if you're getting 2 Seed of Corruption casts out in a pack, which is entirely feasible given it's a 2-second cast time after haste, a 2.5 second baseline, you can easily get an entire pack of 10-15 mobs to full agony stacks and just have the dots rolling. So, Agonizing Corruption, really nice to see. The tier below that, we obviously have our single target Drain Soul, for those of you that like the build, and obviously for some of you that don't, but appreciate just how strong being able to shard snipe is. You have Siphon Life versus Absolute Corruption. Pretty straightforward choice. If you're looking at an AoE/Mythic Plus setting, you're probably going to see something like Absolute Corruption picked. And if you're in a raid setting, probably going to take something like Siphon Life. Finally then, the choice nodes for this tier, before we move further on, is Phantom Singularity versus Vile Taint. Now, they've changed Vile Taint, interestingly enough. Phantom Singularity does what it's always done. It's a 45-second dot cooldown, essentially, that does damage to your target and then all targets within 15 yards, and heals you for 25% of the damage done over 16 seconds. So that hasn't really changed. Really nice ability, definitely going to be a single target pick. Vile Taint, on the other hand, in its current iteration in Shadowlands, is just a dot and snare component. However, they've changed it so it applies both Curse of Exhaustion and Agony to the target, to all targets hit. This means that in a Mythic Plus setting, taking Vile Taint, having Agonizing Corruption and Sow the Seeds means that as long as you've got 2 to 3 shards, you can very, very quickly get all your main dots, so your Agonies and your Corruptions, out rolling and at maximum stacks, while before going into the rest of your rotation, whether it be using Soul Rots, your Haunts, your whatever else you've got in your toolkit. And for some of the other talents available to us, it means that as an Affliction Warlock, you're going to have a lot of free utility, because you're going to apply Curse of Exhaustion to everything, and when we get onto one of our other talents shortly, there's a way to extend Curse of Exhaustion massively. So when we discussed in our previous video about having like maybe Dark Fury versus Shadow Flame and being able to like permanently snare everything, yeah, you don't need to worry about that. Vile Taint's smart application as a augmentation of the Venthia ability, because it's taking the Curse of Exhaustion element of Impending Catastrophe and now applying it to Vile Taint. Whether or not Vile Taint is going to be augmented by something like Amplify Curse is yet to be seen and could be very interesting. Because they are Vile Taint's on a 20-second cooldown, and if you pick Foul Mouth from the class tree, which puts Amplify Curse to a 20-second cooldown, there's every possibility you could just have a almost permanent 70% snare out on everything. But all in all, it's a nice change to Vile Taint. It'll be interesting to see how the shard generation works and whether or not you could technically net a shard profit casting Vile Taint and refreshing all the agonies in an AoE setting. Be nice to see come testing. Following that up then, on the next row, you have Soul Tap. Sacrifice 5% of your soul each to gain a soul shard. Now, this is very much a play on Life Tap, where we used to sacrifice our health for mana. Now, obviously, Warlocks no longer use mana as a primary resource, and we instead live off shards. So, having the Demon Skin, Fell Armor, Soul Link combinations, depending on whether or not Soul Tap has a cooldown, or if it's something that we can just massively spam, is going to dictate how efficient this ability is. Because if it doesn't have a cooldown and something that we can spam, it means that we can always go into packs with 5 shards. Especially for these AoE Mythic Plus settings where you're going to want to Vile Taint, sow the seeds, get a Haunt out, and maybe go through your rotation normally. But being able to have 3+ shards is going to mean that our ability to snap dot everything is going to be a lot nicer and a lot better than where we are currently. Shadow Embrace, that hasn't changed. That is still Shadow Bolt and Drain Soul have a chance to apply Shadow Embrace, increasing the damage dealt to the target by 1.5 for 16 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. Now, the value hasn't changed, but I suspect that's going to be a 1.5% for 16 seconds, stacking up to 3 times, and a 3% for 16 seconds, stacking up to 3 times, which will still be the 9% bonus that we get currently through the talent baseline. You have Groomer of Sacrifice, which is the exact same as it was previously. Sacrifices a demon, gaining its command demon ability, and causes your spells to sometimes also deal extra shadow damage. Lasts an hour or until you summon a pet. Now, chances are Groomer of Sac isn't something that we're likely to take, and this is because the main class tree has too many ways to augment our pet's damage, our pet's health, and we also have abilities like Groomer of Synergy, where the damage done by you or your demon has a chance to grant the other 5% damage for 15 seconds. Which, in an Affliction setting, is really nice, because Groomer of Synergy, or the Synergy Legendary at current, is one of Affliction's main legendary usages in Season 4. So, it'll be interesting to see. But the options there if you don't want the trouble of having a pet, and given that they are decoupling Kick from Fell Hunters, there's every likelihood that by using Groomer of Sacrifice, it's going to allow you to offensively purge and also kick a group, so the utility options may be there, and it means the pet's not getting slapped around as much. We'll see about tuning and whether or not the proc rate for Groomer of Sac is worth. Now, Soulflame is making a return, and Soulflame, for those of you that don't know, was one of the few Affliction abilities from the Uthalesh Artifact Legendary in Legion that made Affliction Warlocks so strong in AoE. The thing is, it's a backloaded AoE, because the tooltip reads, when you kill a target, its soul bursts into flames, dealing 20% of spell damage, Shadow Flame to all targets. 20% of spell power, Shadow Flame damage to all nearby enemies. Sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied. But what this ability means is if you have a target that is going to die before everything else, there's a very strong likelihood, especially in larger packs, that this just chain reacts. So you start off with 1 Soul Flame, into 3, into 5, into 10, into how many your tanks pulled. And in Legion, as a result, this meant that Affliction Warlocks could do stupid amounts of damage AoE-wise if the tank was willing to pull fodder into a pack. Or if you were about to take a pack that was just about to die into a boss. Because then all that Soul Flame damage as everything dies is then fed onto the boss and further amplifies things. So it's really nice from a Mythic Plus setting to see this back, and may see our damage profile change somewhat as we become more geared for executing things or chaining things into stuff. It is going to depend very much on the tanking meta at the time and how the dungeons are tuned, but really happy to see this ability back because it gives Affliction that little bit of extra oomph. And then finally we have Soul Swap. Now, for a 1-shard cost, applies Corruption, Agony, Unstable Affliction to your target. This is really, really nice 30-second cooldown ability that for a shard just means you can get everything out. It saves you a couple of globals and is likely to have some raiding usage and maybe in Mythic Plus. Can't really see it being taken over other abilities like Soul Flame and stuff like that, but still nice to see it, and it'll be really, really good for council fights. So 2-target boss fights and things like that. Underneath that, we have Harvester of Souls. So each time corruption deals damage, it has a 7% chance to heal you for the damage done. So 7% chance to deal 16% of spell power shadow damage to the target and heal you for 100% of that damage dealt. This is basically a 7% chance to proc additional damage that heals you. Think of it like the undead racial, or randomly doing a little bit of shadow damage and getting healed by it. It's a nice augmentation to corruption, but it's not going to break the bank if you don't take it. The tooltip obviously doesn't differentiate between 1 and 2, whether it's a 14% chance to proc, or if the spell damage proc that it does is instead, rather than 16%, could be 32%. Yet to see, but being able to augment it opens up a few other options. We also have Withering Bolt. This is the conduit that we currently have access to for Affliction anyway, where Shadow Bolt and Drain Soul deal 7% increased damage per damage over time effect you have on the active target, which is going to see more use in single target when you consider that you'd have things like Siphon Life, Phantom Singularity, and it obviously opens up our other options. So let's get into Sacrilegious. Oh, well, we'll discuss the third tier in a moment, because you've got Sacrilegious Dark Strike. So corruption damage is increased by 7%, and each time it deals damage, any of your curses active on the target are extended by 1 or 2 seconds. This is what I was talking about, being able to have permanent Curse of Exhaustion up through the use of Vile Taint, and whether or not it then gets amplified. Because if Sacrilegious Dark Strike, which increases, so 2 points in it, increases corruption damage by 15%, and each time it deals damage, any of your curses active on the target are extended by 2 seconds. Which, Curse of Exhaustion, 12 seconds, 50% snare, you're going to get a few ticks, you're going to be able to extend that probably to 16, 20 seconds. And Amplify Curse, potentially keep it up full time, maybe. But either which way, Sacrilegious is going to be nice utility for your tank, and does mean that something like Shadow Flame really isn't needed. And you are going to be fighting for your snare spot with Frost Mages, so have fun duking that out. Underneath that, I just move Harvester of Souls for a second. We have Deathbolt. Deathbolt is currently a PvP talent and has kind of been doing the numbers for a while, because what Deathbolt does is you launch a bolt of death at the target, accumulating 50% of the remaining damage from your spells on the target and dealing it over 3 seconds. If you're using absolute corruption, it counts up to 14 seconds of corruption's damage, as though you pretty much just applied it. And all in all, this is generally a very hard hitting ability, and as you can see, it's a 3 soul shard cost, 1 second cast time, 30-second cooldown ability. So it's going to hit like a dumpster truck, or at least it should hit like a dumpster truck. Obviously we'll have to see with tuning, but it's nice to see that we're getting it as a talent, and it's not just being hoyed away with some of the other PvP talents that we've got. Soul Rot, really good to see that back. Don't really need to discuss too much about it, because it is currently the soul conduit of choice. Basically, it hits up to 3 targets, or 4 targets including your current, causing your primary target to suffer nature damage, and puts a dot on all the targets. For the next 8 seconds, casting Drain Life will cause your Drain Life to also drain from any enemy affected by your Soul Rot. Drain Life will not consume any mana. Now, this is the combination where having Soul Rot and Inevitable Demise with the Claw of Endereath, from a PvP perspective, is a lot of burst, because it's a 4-target heavy Drain Life that casts 30% faster, or channels 30% faster, which means that you are going to have that snap level of burst AoE essentially, especially when we have options like Decaying Soul Satchel still available to us in the tree. Now, Haunt is seeing a bit of a change. At current, the baseline Haunt is given to us in this talent. So it's a 10% damage increase to the target for 18 seconds. If the target dies, Horn's cooldown is reset, which is great. However, as we go into the tree, we can see that it further gets augmented and becomes a lot stronger than its current incarnation. Finally, we obviously have Summon Dark Glare here in the bottom right. Now, having Summon Dark Glare this far down the tree and as a talent is kind of concerning. And the reason it's kind of concerning is because with the change from Unstable Affliction being able to be multi-stacked and being our shard spender to the Malefic Rapture build, Summon Dark Glare is very much a cooldown of the past. It's not a particularly strong cooldown that we can feel as a tangible benefit. It doesn't do a lot of damage compared to Tyrant or Infernal, and the dot extension, although it can be nice in places, isn't really needed. We don't need it too much, especially if we have talents like Pandemic Invocation where we get rewarded and potentially generate a shard for refreshing our dots. And if we go into the tree below, kind of working against the grain this time, we're going to go from right to left. So directly under Dark Glare, we have Antoran Plating. So Dark Glare increases its damage by an additional 3% for each damage over time effect active, and Dark Glare lasts an additional 5 seconds. Now, if we put the points in there, we can have a look and see it's 5% for each damage over time effect, and Dark Glare lasts an additional 10 seconds. So it lasts for 30 seconds, and its damage is going to be increased by 15% for every dot you have active across all targets, which in its current incarnation at least isn't particularly impressive. Like a Summon Dark Glare will do maybe 3% of your total damage, if that, and it's a 2-minute cooldown. Like, I have trinkets that do more damage than a 2-minute cooldown. So, and then Antoran Plating leads into Wilfred's, which just reduces the cooldown of Summon Dark Glare, which we don't use currently. So I can't really see Dark Glare actually being picked, or the extra points going down into it. You might take 1 point for Summon Dark Glare just to have a 2-minute cooldown, but yeah. You have Wrath of Consumption, which is another legendary that Affliction's getting, which is Corruption and Agony granted an application of Wrath of Consumption when a target dies, increasing all periodic damage dealt by 3% for 30 seconds, stacking up to 5 times. Very much going to be a Mythic Plus option, or maybe a raid setting where you have lots of ads that are dying frequently. But, as I said, probably going to just see it as a Mythic Plus option. Now, Horned. Horned becomes augmented by Seized Vitality. Horned deals 10% additional damage. When the Horned spell ends or is dispelled, the soul returns to you, healing for 50% of the damage it did to the target. Now, 2 points in that, deals 20% additional damage. When the Horned spell ends or is dispelled, the soul returns to you, healing you for 100% of the damage it dealt, which is an extra bit of utility for us in the terms it gives us a bit more self-healing and makes us that little bit tankier. Not that Warlocks needed it, but it's nice to have. But that opens up Haunted Soul. Haunted Soul, your Haunt spell, also increases the damage of your damage over time effects to all targets by 20%. This means that Haunt is augmented from being a single target 10% damage increase to your target to hitting 20% harder and then healing you as a byproduct of it, to then just amping all your dots across all targets by 20%. So from a Mythic Plus perspective, you're likely to see a situation where you've put your Vile Taint out, you put a couple of your Seed of Corruptions out, you've got your Agonies rolling, you've got Absolute Corruption ticking, and then you can go into just mass increasing your dot damage across the board, while then feeding into your Inevitable Demise, Soul Rots, and you're buffing your corruption damage even further because you can take something like both Sacrilegious Dark Strike, so Corruption's dealing 15% increased damage, and then also has a 7% chance to proc additional damage through Harvester Assault, healing you while we're at it. So Haunt becomes a AoE damage increase and not just a single target increase going forward. So you're likely to see a permanent pickup here in terms of Haunt. Now, Deliberate Malice is Malefic Rapture's damage is increased by 12%. Let's just drop some points so we can check the tooltip. 25% with 2 points, and each cast extends the duration of Corruption, Agony, and Unstable Affliction by 2 seconds, and that leads into Calamitous Crescendo, which is basically just the tier set that Affliction is currently running at the moment. So Deliberate Malice and Calamitous Crescendo are the Sepulchre of the first ones, tier 28, tier 29 tier sets. So while Agony, Corruption, and Unstable Affliction are active, your Shadowbolt has a 30% chance, and your Drain Soul has a 20% chance to make your next Malefic Rapture cost no soul shards and be cast instantly. Quite nice. But depending on how often you plan on casting Malefic Rapture versus Sow the Seeds, and whether you're in a single target or AoE setting, kind of depends. Soul Rot leads into Decaying Soul Satchel. Don't really need to talk too much about DSS, because every target afflicted by your Soul Rot increases your haste and crit chance by a percentage for 8 seconds. This percentage has yet to be decided, but I suspect it's probably going to be roughly the 5% that we have currently. So you're going to get 20% haste and crit for 8 seconds every time you Soul Rot on a minute CD. Really nice, especially in Mythic Plus. That leads into Creeping Death. Your Agony, Corruption, Siphon Life, and Unstable Affliction deal their full damage 15% faster. Now, Creeping Death's going to be an interesting one, because obviously this means that you're artificially shortening the duration of all your dots in order for them to deal their damage a little bit faster, so you're going to have to be on top of refreshing and things like that. Having Creeping Death may be something that then leads into enabling Dark Glare to be a thing, because if you're extending the duration of the dots, they're then just cranking out more damage. So potentially something nice to see there. You then obviously have your traditional Malefic Wrath. That is the legendary we've got at the moment. Malefic Rapture increases the damage of your Shadowbolt and Drain Soul by 20% for 10 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. That is bonkers, because that's, if you can maintain it, that's a 60% damage increase to your Shadowbolts and Drain Souls permanently. Obviously, Malefic Wrath, I suspect Malefic Wrath early on is going to be less of a pick, because it is going to boil down to how quickly we can generate and maintain shards. Because one of the benefits of the current system is we are able to use both Deliberate Malice, Calamitous Crescendo, and our innate shard generation to be able to maintain Malefic Wrath for a reasonable amount of time. The problem is that that obviously impairs our ability to move. We become very, very static. And I suspect early on, at least within Dragonflight, we're not going to be wanting to touch Malefic Wrath too much unless our shard generation is drastically improved by things like Pandemic Invocation. Now, Deathbolt transitions into Death Dealer. Spending a soul shard has a 5 or 10% chance to make your next Deathbolt have no cost and be instant cast. This is really, really nice, because obviously it frees up the 3 soul shards required to spend Deathbolt, if we can get it to proc. And then Pact of the Nathrazim. Deathbolt extends the damage of your damage over time effects on its target by 4 seconds before applying its damage. This, and obviously the way the Deathbolt works is it's taking 50% of what remains. So having Writhing Agony, your Siphon Life, your Phantom Singularity, Haunt, and then refreshing all of those and then hitting Deathbolt is the ideal time to cast it, because they've all still got their entire duration left. It's going to do a lot more damage than if they only had, say, 5 seconds each left. However, Pact of the Nathrazim, Deathbolt extends the duration on its target by 4 seconds, so you can get away with casting it at, say, that 5-second mark, because it's going to treat all your dots as though they had 9-10 seconds left. So Deathbolt, pretty nice, and the Death Dealer Pact of the Nathrezim combination is a really nice augment to Deathbolt and will make it a little bit more attractive. Now, we've discussed the talents. Let's have a look at what I suspect a build might look like, depending on whether you're single target or AoE. So we'll start with the single target side of things. We'll pick these up. I suspect we'll see something like this. You could also take Pandemic Invocation over Inevitable Demise here. I personally prefer Inevitable Demise and Drain Lifing because I'm likely to play something like Claw of Enderath as a legendary, so Siphon Life, Phantom Singularity. I'm then going to want to pick up Soul Swap, Shadow's Embrace. Withering Bolt is going to take 2 points. I'm probably going to then double back up and get Pandemic Invocation. I've still got 2 points left to spend. And this is where I can kind of play around with things a little bit. So I could put a point in Soul Tap to allow me to generate shards while in combat, because we're going to have passive regen of Soul Leech anyway, and then maybe drop a point in either Soul Flame or Sacrilegious Dark Strike, because that just increases corruption damage. I'm then going to be taking Haunt. I want to augment Haunt completely. Soul Rot, Deliberate Malice. Malefic Rapture extends at increasing Malefic Rapture damage. We're going to want Calamitous Crescendo, so it has a chance to proc 3 MRs for us. And we have 2 points to spend. These 2 points are then going to decide how we want to play, because this is where things open up a little bit depending on the fight space. So if it's not too damaging, we could take Malefic Wrath and we could take a Deathbolt, or we could take a Dark Glare and have something like this. And this is being able to extend our dots, do a little bit of damage, and just literally use the Dark Glare as a dot extension if I'm moving or things like that. But going back to what I was saying about Pandemic Invocation and kind of how we want to play with that, I kind of see it being more of a case of I'd take a second point in Sacrilegious Dark Strike to increase corruption damage and have a build similar to this. If we were to go down an AoE route, we obviously pick these up. Absolute Corruption, Vile Taint, Soul Flame, 2 points in Sacrilegious. We'd come across to pick Harvester of Souls. We could put a point in Withering Souls, and this is just to increase the Shadowbolt / Drain Soul damage. Or, in my case, what I'd probably end up doing is coming across, drop that. I need 2 points in there to get my Soul Rot. 2 points in there, Rot, dirt. And I have something that looks like this. I could probably drop a point from Sacrilegious to pick up Wrath of Consumption, depending on the dungeon. And this would still give me a level of utility, and I still have Inevitable Demise for my snap usage when it comes to using my Claw of Enderath, and my Soul Rot for the crit and haste at 50 stacks. And with both Agonizing Corruption, so the Seeds, Vile Taint, I'm going to be able to do a lot of AoE very early on in the pack, which is not necessarily expected of something like an Affliction Warlock. You expect us to be a little bit slower off the mark compared to something like Demonology or Destruction. And I feel like a build like this is very much going to counter that, while still having something like Soul Flame that is going to emphasize the end of pack damage that people expect from Affliction. So, all in all, I think these are quite... I think it's a nice tree for Affliction. Obviously, there's a few things that we could definitely improve on, and I think Dark Glare definitely needs something done to it further to make it feel more like a cooldown, because in both situations it kind of feels like I'm either spending just the 1 point, or I'd rather not spend any points in it at all because there's no need to. Obviously, tuning may prove me wrong. feel free to comment below with your thoughts and opinions, and in the next video we will move on and discuss Demonology and just work our way through the specs that way. I will obviously link each video in the description below as they come out, and I will also put them all in their own individual playlist. In the meantime though, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you all in the next one, folks. Take care and have a good one.